Hello, I'm Tessa Boyd-Kane from Australia's National Research Organisation for Women's Safety, ANROWS, and I'm delighted to welcome you to this webinar on Indigenous methodologies as part of our series on Australia's National Research Agenda. I'm joining from the lands of the Gadigal, on whose lands the ANROWS office is privileged to stand, and I recognise the ongoing custodianship of the land and also the welcome traditionally provided to people from many other lands as a meeting place. At ANROWS, we acknowledge that research has traditionally silenced First Nations voices and that this has been to the detriment of our response to women, children and the broader community. So we pay our respects to Elders past and present, and also to the leadership of First Nations in building the evidence base that is really critical to the work ahead for this nation and for all of us in ending violence against women and children. Yesterday, I was listening to a First Nations researcher talking about wise practice in the context of colonialism, who invited us collectively to turn to communities for leadership, not only for data and evidence, as key steps towards better practice. And I've been reflecting on that wisdom and thinking about the role that ANROWS needs to play. So I want to here reaffirm our commitment to two-way learning in our ways of working with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, both researchers and with communities more broadly, as we continue to walk alongside and stand for the unfinished business of voice, treaty and truth-telling in this country. This webinar is the second in a series that explores the National Research Agenda and particularly the 6 ways of working and ways of knowing that are set out in that agenda. The Research Agenda is a national framework identifying what evidence is needed to end domestic, family and sexual violence and how that evidence should be created. Australia's National Research Agenda was produced by ANROWS in co-design with victim survivors, researchers and practitioners. And it's an agenda that aims to help evidence producers ensure their work is organised, purposeful and effective. The agenda is built around 8 priorities that you can see on your screen now. These are the areas where new evidence is sorely needed to inform our responses to gender-based violence going forward. But like with anything, it's not just what we do, it's how we do it. And Australia's National Research Agenda calls on researchers to reflect on their methods and ways of collaborating. We call these the ways of working and ways of knowing. And they are making better use of existing data, Indigenous methodologies, valuing practitioners' expertise, listening to children when they are children, working with the knowledge of experts by experience, and creating space for pilots and evaluations of community-led interventions. This webinar series is one way that we at ANROWS are supporting researchers and research collaborators, whether they're funders, partners or participants, to build the knowledge and understanding of Australia's National Research Agenda and to embed these ways of knowing and ways of working into practice. Today's webinar is focused on Indigenous methodology. And in developing the webinar with the panellists, we heard a very clear critique that traditional webinar formats are not in keeping with decolonising processes or approaches. So today's webinar does not have a formal facilitator, nor a format where questions will be posed to and answered by the panellists. Our speakers today expressed a desire to yarn with you about power and positionality, about decolonising methodologies, about connections and partnerships, about strengths-based approaches, and about cultural safety. I want to thank each of the panellists for their leadership and work with us to convene this panel and to share their expertise with you. We appreciate them leading ANROWS in this way, and we also appreciate you, the audience, coming along in this process, because decolonising processes take us all to places that we need to go and to see how together we can work to continue that. With that opening, it's my absolute pleasure to introduce our panel today. I'm delighted to introduce Fiona Cornforth of the Wusathi and Mululugal peoples, who holds national roles for creating meaningful systems change, contributing knowledge on what heals, as well as the power and strength of First Peoples cultures to lead that change. Professor Juanita Sherwood, a proud Wiradjuri woman, registered nurse, teacher, lecturer, researcher and manager with over 30 years experience in Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander health and education. And Dr. Nicole Tujague, a descendant of the Cubby Cubby Nation from Mount Bopal, Queensland, and from the Australian South Sea Islander people from Goa Island in Vanuatu. Nicole is particularly interested in Indigenous methodologies of data collection and analysis and cultural safety in trauma-informed practice. Unfortunately, Tanika Perry is not able to join us today, but I will leave you in the very strong and capable hands of our excellent panel and hand over to them for the conversation ahead.
Thanks so much, Tessa. Well, so good to be on this panel with you guys. And yeah, for me, Professor Sherwood, it's the first time we've met in person. And Fiona, it's lovely to see you again after a fairly long time. So yeah, can't wait to yarn.
Yeah. Good to see you both. Yeah, and thanks, Tessa, for setting the scene a bit and just for your commitment to engage with us the way the organisation continues to.
Yeah. And thank you for asking us to be here today to share our ways of knowing and being and doing around the important issues of Indigenous research methodologies and our data sovereignty and ways we work together. So yes, we're very happy to be here, and we're sad that Tanika couldn't make it today, but we hope to be able to share as much as we can with you guys today. So shall we talk about Indigenous methodologies?
Yeah, sorry, go on.
They've given us a few themes here to talk about. Does one of them stick out as the first you want to kind of start yarning about?
Sorry. I was just going to say I've just sort of tackled the headings as they were given to us. And the first one was power and positionality. And there are just maybe a couple of things. Do you want to start, Professor Sherwood, on that? I've made some notes so I don't forget important things, but if you'd like to start, that's fine. Power and positionality.
Yeah, I thought the reason I thought it was important to talk about the power and positionality is why we've developed Indigenous research methodologies. We wanted to shift the power from a Western way of doing business with us and opening up our ways and acknowledging our ways of knowing and being and doing, which are very different in the research space. And having a standpoint on recognising Indigenous research methodologies has been, an active activism for the last 30 years of First Nations peoples all around the world. We've been really lucky to be working, I've been really lucky to work with Linda Toy Smith and other First Nations peoples from across Australia and from Canada, from New Zealand, from America, from Hawaii, from Sami lands. That we share a very strong way of doing business around building our ways of knowing and being and doing, which have been oppressed by a Western power of Western powers knowledge spaces. We talk about it as hegemony and power-based approaches, which have described and constructed Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in this country as problematic. We today talk about deficit discourse, which is really the underlying theme, but a lot of the way research was undertaken built experts, non-Indigenous experts who didn't know us, didn't bother speaking to us effectively, didn't talk to us safely, and from their ways of knowing and being and doing built a colonial story around and about us. And unfortunately, we know from ongoing education that those stories have impacted on the way, first, not just Indigenous Australians, but all Australians learn about our people. And so the role of us taking up the ways of thinking and doing and being and practicing and focusing on Indigenous ways of knowing, on Indigenous research, is vital to us flipping that story, shifting those constructions and shifting the power.
Thanks, Professor Sherwood. I guess from my perspective, everything comes through a trauma lens, and I would have to support what you've just said about decolonizing research, methodologies, data analysis methods. They're all addressing power and differences, and they're all part of us decolonizing the world that we live in. And, you know, if you look through a trauma lens, it involves understanding how our belief systems are formed and recognizing when we're challenged by new ways of knowing, being, and doing. So being self-aware enough to feel in your body when something bumps up against your nervous system and be able to go, oh, I'm curious about that. And if you think that there is no one truth, that's the hardest thing, I think, for a lot of people to get their head around. But if there's a civilization that's survived in harmony with the earth for over 65,000 years, there must be another way of knowing, being, and doing, and must be another truth that's valid and robust. So what's really exciting now too is we're being able to draw on lots of Indigenous methodologies for data collection, for research, for data analysis. That when I have to say, when I first started using these methodologies, something felt really right and comfortable and felt really collective in nature. And just being in academia, having to explain why those methods were robust and believable helped me to really appreciate the collective nature of a lot of those methodologies. And you also touched on strength-based approaches, and language changes the way we operate in the world. Deficit language has a psychological effect on the body. If someone tells you that you're vulnerable, you feel the weight of those words straight away. If someone says you're a priority, that word makes you feel strong and hopeful. So, a lot of it has got to do with language that we use and being strength-based.
Yeah, and I just build on, I guess, and support what's being said. But in keeping people their most resourceful selves in the undertaking of research, that's what prevents further harm and acknowledges that there is there are wrongs to right in this area in particular. So when you look at power and positionality, there's still too many people who think we don't deserve to stand in that power, or have a leadership position, or to insist that you privilege ways of knowing, being, and doing. I'm very proud. I've got the best job in the world of heading up a national centre for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander research. And we've been gifted a beautiful Ngunnawal name called Yadra Walani, which is healthy, strong, healthy place. And that's our vision. It's always our elders' vision. But why this work means so much to me and communities is that we keep people in that power. And keep people positioned to lead. We won't undertake any project here unless community has listed it as a priority and they want us to do it on their behalf. They have that trust in us and that faith to do it. And, you know, of 60 people, 28 are Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander researchers, but you best believe that every other person in the centre knows how to centre the community and its leadership in their research work. And so I absolutely know it can be done because I see it every day. and it's very powerful. It actually impacts on the quality. And so even from a quality perspective, when it comes to findings, results, advancing causes, advancing the nation and its nation building, we should be operating as often as possible in this way.
Yeah. Fiona, you sort of jumped right down into one of the questions for today, which I'm really interested to hear from your perspective too, because it's what's the role of non-Indigenous researchers working alongside First Nations? Well, let's just say First Nations researchers. What have you found has been really working there? I'm really interested to know.
Yeah, we did a big family and community safety study here, and it was before I joined, but I got to be an advisor on that study, and it involved Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal researchers. And one of them went on to work on a PhD, one of the non-Aboriginal, because she saw that the solution of community was the way forward for everyone, not just for our lot. And so very clearly from being a part of that project. And she's guided by Aboriginal leadership, obviously, and our Aboriginal leadership take on that role here, because we can't do it on our own. As in, we can't change the whole system on our own. So, yeah, we take that teaching very seriously. Some people say we're not education. We don't do education. Yeah, the institution will say that, but we absolutely do in the way that we undertake our work. Yeah. People are watching, people are seeing, and we've got a Lancet podcast and an article on the impacts of racism on health. And that's because of the impact of the work that we do, right? And so going back to your question there, Nicole, the role is to just accept that it is the quality way, it is the better way. The solutions are there. You can no longer exclude the people you want to make change for. In fact, inclusion isn't enough. It's allowing yourself to be led.
Yeah.
Exactly. Good point.
Yeah, totally agree. I think that also, coming back to, it is a strength-based approach. It is developing ways, initially, it is developing ways of knowing and being and doing that are vital to the well-being of our people. And for a very long time, we've been working with people who have been working with us, and we've been encouraging partnerships to be co-designers, to be open to listening. And I think that's probably the biggest story that we've brought to research, is getting our non-Indigenous friends, peers, to be open to listen and not interrupt when people are sharing their stories or sharing their experiences. And the sharing of knowledge is something very special. It's not like taking a survey. It's people are giving their time, they're giving their knowledge, and if anything is not free in our communities, is our knowledge. And the fact that our people are there providing that information in ways that is meaningful to them, we have to ensure that that environment's safe for them to provide that information. And sometimes, I've been in research projects where our elders and informants have been shut down by the next question to be asked, and they feel hurt and injured. So the process of listening and letting people tell their story is so vital to making this a safe practice for everybody.
Yeah, I mean, the third point there, the theme, connections and partnerships, is really, if it's our way and our methodology, that's relationship building. So there shouldn't be any conversations happening for work or for action or for activity, unless there's a conversation for relationship.
Yes.
Right. And that can't be within the scope of a particular project in the idea of one individual. Yeah, it has to be, or a few individuals. It has to be, yeah, there has to be those relationships that are invested in. So that's where you get the trust. That's where you get the leadership and the yeah. If you want to do it the right way, that's the right way. Yeah.
So true, Fiona. I think instead of thinking connections, networking, partnerships, start thinking meaningful relationships. That's really important. I remember, like, so many times people have said to me, well, how do I reach out in the community? How do I make relationships and build collaborations with the community around me? And I remember an elder once being asked that question, and she said, well, you know how to make a friend, don't you? And I thought that was a classic, because I thought, it's othering in itself to be thinking, how do I reach out to them to, build find out about them, be thinking of it as, what can I offer to the local people in my area, and what might they be able to share with me that's going to be meaningful for both of us. I think that's really important. And Professor Sherwood, you started talking there about co-design, and co-design, it's such a buzzword now, and it's definitely a step in the right direction. I'm challenged still by it, in that I think the first question to ask is it co-design that we want here, or is it co-creation? And a lot of times we go in with co-design, and the non-Indigenous partner has still got the end result in mind, or the outcomes. And we know for our communities, we're often doing research that our communities don't even think is important. They want us to be investigating other things. And, just going back to our strengths base, I really love the work of Chandler. It's his name, Michael Chandler, was that? The Canadian researcher. And, instead of, a lot of our research revolves around, why are there so many suicides happening in Indigenous communities? Why are our mob going into being incarcerated? And he actually did this flip thing where he was investigating youth suicide in British Columbia. And he thought, I'm going to go into the communities where there are no suicides, and I'm going to find out what's common about all of those communities. And that's just flipping the research agenda on its head, thinking strengths-based. And he came up with all this amazing data about communities that have autonomy and have land rights, actually aren't plagued with things like suicide. And I think co-design, do we want co-design, or do we want co-creation? And how do we change our whole research agenda?
Funding. How do we change the funding agenda? And I think that, influencing that space is vital for us to be inclusive of ways of doing business. And we are challenged by still the power of the Western research model. And I think that's a really important positioning, again, going back to power. And who funds the research holds the power. And we need to be, aware of how do we utilize that space, and how do we work, with others to ensure that, as you said, Fiona, before, the relationships are really important that we build. And we do need to build relationships with our non-Indigenous researcher peers, because growing that strength within our systems, within our programs, within our projects is really vital. And that requires not just a relationship, but an education. It requires decolonising the way things have been done in research. And that's not easy. I think it's really incredibly, there's a lot to be unpacked in this space. And the way knowledge production has been produced is really important to how we roll that out and how we develop that relationship of, we've got to unpack this space. We know racism is a problem. We know ongoing colonisation is the issue. We know all of these praxis are impacting on what we can do and how we can do research. And Nicole, I think you're spot on. It's the way to promote the positive projects, but we've also got to tell our stories. And we've got to influence people. I think the referendum really suggested that we need to do more around telling our story.
Yeah. Look, we find ourselves, building relationships. We've got really good relationships with funders, and helping them see research differently too. Helping them understand that our communities have knowledge holders who
they are knowledge holders.
Unequivocal, unmatched knowledge in a lot of respects. And so, we've got community partners, research partners, and there's an exchange, there's a relationship, and they do author our papers. And we sometimes push for organisations to author papers, because that's absolutely who's holding the knowledge, who've done the testing, done the empirical studies, so they should be. And that's a disruption to the academic system, but the information is so vital in how this nation continues to build.
Yes. And that's an important part of that relationship building, is that we have to keep informing that space and putting investment in there and making it a safe environment for people to unpack those stories. And we are regularly, and I guess that's really important for First Nation researchers, that there is a cultural load to building this space. I like this. There's a colonial load of having to ensure that we do need to give people opportunities to learn more about the 240 years of colonial implications, particularly, Nicole, the trauma line. And that's vital.
I think the more we can get published around our ways of knowing, being, doing, the better as well. I know going through my PhD, I found lots of great Indigenous methodologies for collecting data. I think we've published well in that space. When I went to do my data analysis, everyone expected me just to go back to a Western way of analysing the data. And I was like, okay, this is not going to work here. So I was lucky enough as one of my supervisors to have Dr. Sean Wilson, who's a Cree man from Canada. And he's written, if anyone's interested, he's written a small book that's a really easy read, Researcher's Ceremony, Dr. Sean Wilson. And that's a great resource. But I also borrowed some of Tyson Younger-Porter's work around thought rituals. And so I was able to do my data analysis with thought rituals and analysing in a collective way. And also a Canadian method of what spoke to your heart. I don't think that's exactly the right name for it. But what was really interesting was every time I went to explain a collective data analysis, I bumped up against a Western methodology saying, hang on, this needs to be just your work because that's what you're getting this qualification on. And I was reading all this stuff from my Indigenous peers saying, and elders saying, how can you be ignorant enough to think that your one opinion alone can analyze this data? And that just felt right for me. So I had my little team where I said, I've got this information. These are the things I'm finding. What do you think that means? And they were able to go, well, have you thought about that, Nicole? And perhaps it means this. And that collective way of analyzing the data was so powerful. And it just made me feel in my heart that doing things in a Western way is not right for us. And so the more we can publish and have those tools out there for researchers, I know for me that was really, really helpful.
Yes.
But I still had to make those arguments all the way along. But that was good. And when you have to make that argument, it's just embedding for you what's really right for you. So, yeah.
I think that's a really important story, Nicole, because I think we have had to tell that story and change those storylines over the last 30 years. We've had to say that is what is amazing about Indigenous research methodology. We're shifting the sands, we're making changes, and we're bringing in the knowledges of many, like you said, Canada and all over the place. Anyway, they're really critical ways of influencing and shifting, and I totally back you. Let's not stick our data back into a Western model of assessing. That's just, again, a problematic constructive way of doing, and we've got to change that. And our writing does change that. And as you said, the more we write, the more we publish, the more we will be shifting this space as well.
So just that acceptance I was talking about when you're coming into the relationship, like you're right, we can't carry that burden or hold that burden for the whole country on educating. And maybe if they'll learn, they'll understand and will be treated better. It's like, that's not going to change things overnight. And there are some people who just want to bring it. And there's studies to show that as well. But when you're talking, Nicole, about sitting around having those discussions with key people, that's what it's about. And usually there's a justice vision, right? In those groups. And I'm really fortunate to be led by Sandra Creamer and some aunties from Badu, and for example, who are on this ministerial council, and we drafted the first standalone action plan for keeping for domestic family and sexual violence. But we said to them, no, you're not going to hire us just for this little while, not hire us or appoint us, and we do this plan for you. We want to do the context. You got to understand the context for why these things are happening. And they said, okay, yeah, well, let's call it a theory of change. Do a theory of change because we need that. And we said, all right, let's undertake that work. But we called it change creation model because it's not a theory. Because all those people together in that room knew how to change, and what the impacts might be. And so we got that there. And what it does is talk about how disjointed everything is, the disruption, the trauma impacts, the intergenerational burdens that we carry that aren't ours to carry. And it also talks about what would happen if our resources came back to us. What would happen if what was stolen was given back? What would happen if those safe, loving and nurturing families that we've always had in our communities were protected by the colonial forces, right? And so it's such a powerful piece, but it's seen together with this action plan now. And it has to be, because what's written in there, and I talk about the aunties again, I talk about Auntie Sandra, they've been doing this work literally for decades, many decades, in our communities. And so, yeah, it's such an honour to work alongside them, but they, what's in it? What when you talk about reading between the lines, it's love. It's the love of their land, sky, sea, people, and everyone who's come here. It's just love, and you know, those powerful moments I'll treasure forever with those groups. And we are about justice, and the relationship's got to be about this. So if you're thinking about what you can contribute to Indigenous research, it has to be how the communities get back or get some more ownership over, or total ownership over the way forward. And look, I sit here at the National Centre with research data to say that if we weren't experiencing racism, our levels of experiencing high psychological distress would reduce by 50%.
Yeah.
You know, so you know, have an anti-racist agenda. Understand from go to woe in your research process how you center, how you prevent further trauma, how you keep people in power, to stand in power, and what your service to those people are. From, like I said, from go to woe.
Yeah.
I've just finished listening to the Kep Enderby Memorial Lecture, where the research was done about racism in Australia. Not that we needed research to tell us, but it's working in an empirical way. I couldn't agree more. This is about racism, and racism is fear. So this is about fear. So how do we, and I think it's about being courageous too. What you're talking about there, Fiona, is courage to push back against a system that's not right for us. You know, about 7 or 8 years ago, we decided in the Seedling Group that we weren't going to enter into the tendering process. We felt it wasn't the way we as mob work. It creates lateral violence. It, you know, people would come with their budgets and we'd be going, but you can't do that in your budget. You know, so it takes courage, but I can honestly say we've never looked back. And things are more important than getting the work and getting the job. It's our families, it's our communities that we're working to heal. So I think it takes a lot of courage. And I think I see courage when you start talking about that. No, we're not going to do a theory of change. That's not right for us. We're going to do this. And I really applaud that when I see that. And, you know, it makes me feel stronger too, to push back against systems that don't work for us.
Should we dive into some of the questions?
Some questions, yeah.
Oh, Kathy's back on to help us with that.
I hesitated coming back into the conversation because what you've been sharing and delving into is just so rich and so deep. I think there's a lot more that we could learn just by listening to you, but thank you for the conversation so far and for the space to pick up some of the questions that people have been contributing. I did just want to share with you, we've reached 850 participants in the live stream and many more will catch up later. And there is so much interest coming through the Q&A for additional resources to keep learning, for links to many of the things that you've talked about already, Fiona, the webinar you mentioned on racism in health, but also all of the research that you spoke to through the conversation. And Nicole, just have to give you a shout out. There's much love for your backdrop and people would love to be able to see more of that. So there's a lot of really active engagement in the discussion. I wanted to come to you with a question that came in actually really early in the conversation, and it was picking up your starting point around Standpoint. And the question was about the impact of gender on Standpoint. And I just wanted to give you some space to pick up on that if you want to, in the context of where you've taken us already in the conversation.
Good. I can start just by simply to say that when I referred to that work we've done, my change creation model, yes, there was a minister, women's safety, and yes, we have a research organisation for women's safety, but when you're working with our communities and our elders, it's the whole community. It's restoring the wellness of the individual, the family, and the community. That and it's a generational lens of what do we do today? What do we do right now in this plan that means that the burden's lessened for our next generation or the emerging generation? And that's such a wonderful example of how research has more quality about it, more room for impact if we're being led by the right people.
Totally.
Let me move then. Sorry, I wasn't sure. Did you want to pick up on that?
I was just going to add something then about what Fiona said. One of the main findings of my PhD research is if it's not healing, we're wasting our time. If it's not interrupting intergenerational trauma, then why are we doing it? And I think there's an opportunity for us in our research, in our evaluation work, in every point that we connect with community, to ask ourselves, is it healing what we're doing? Because a lot of the outcomes that are put to us when we go into research work or evaluation work, a lot of those outcomes don't really address those things. And it's really about looking at perpetrators and victims. It's looking at whole communities. And if you understand trauma, you understand that this is not a blame game. This is about healing everybody. And so I just wanted to support what Fiona said there.
Mm-hmm. Professor Sherwood, was there anything you wanted to bring in?
Well, I think gendered knowledges are really vital too. And I think that that's something we, being a female, I probably do a lot of work with women, and I think it's really important that women's ways of knowing and being and doing have been, again, as we've said, 65,000 years plus, have been, very nurturing to our communities. I guess I've done a lot of work with women in prison and have witnessed how important it is that we continue to back our women. A lot of our, you put a mother in prison and you totally created this, an injured family, not just the nuclear concept, but the whole extended family. And we need to be aware that, the dynamics of ongoing colonisation, and I think that's what we need to be bringing up in our research spaces as well, and particularly, when we've got governments who've just brought in that they can lock up our 10-year-olds, we need to be thinking about how do we challenge this space. And when you put an Aboriginal mother in a prison, you've deconstructed and injured a whole extended family. And I think that way of understanding the gender in our communities is really vital and different to a mainstream agenda around gender.
Thank you. There's been a lot of interest in the questions online that pick up on your discussion about relationships and collaboration. And some of the questions go to caution about Western ways of listening and relating that are, really clearly in search of answers, and not having that practice about deep listening that you've talked about as being so important. And some of the other questions go to the tokenism that can be so evident in relationship building. So I just wanted to bring together a series of those questions to invite any further reflections from you about those issues, and even any sort of advice or guidance you have, particularly about what are the hallmarks that you value in good collaboration or in co-design.
Okay, would you like to go there?
I first, I guess I would like to start by saying, one of the mantras I've lived my life by in business specifically is don't blame a person, blame a system. And when I see people taking knowledge and not listening, trying to gather information to get their own credentials, it's really because we live in a world where that's what we reward. We reward if you come back with these answers. We reward you if you do it in this time frame, if you do it in this budget. Don't worry about all that other story. That's the winding road where all the gold is. Just get what that question wants you to get. And so again, it's really about deconstructing your whole way of learning how to do what you've done and trusting the winding road. And, if you think about it neurologically, when someone is telling you a story, if you allow them to tell you the full story, you're getting all of these other facts that are possibly really, for sure, they are really, really important and relevant that you may not have heard if you just asked that question and wanted the answer and then left. So again, going back to an Indigenous methodology of storytelling, the data is so much richer, so much more meaningful, and you're being respectful at the same time. But if you're working in a system that rewards you to work in a different way, you've got to push back against the system before you can start working in that way. So, yeah.
That requires you to review the research again to support your way of doing business. And I think that's the beauty of First Nation research, is that we have been building that storyline, that our ways of knowing and being and doing are vital tools for examining safely how to work with our people and hear their stories, rather than putting a survey together to collect information that we know isn't very user-friendly and it doesn't provide the entire story that we need to tell. We need to tell the whole story, and we need to keep on doing that.
Yeah. I agree. And look, and also how trauma, how we are re-traumatized through telling our stories sometimes too, and just acknowledging that, having that trauma knowledge that you talk about, Nicole, and relationships serve that really well. But I try and just give really good examples to illustrate and demonstrate, but there's still a lot of extraction going on, and non-Indigenous consultants too that call me up, email me, can we have a coffee because I have this job to get this done. And you know exactly what they're trying to do, what they're attempting to do. And so I learned probably the hard way to put those boundaries up, just say no, see people coming a mile away. And it's hard because I like to give and share and everything, but that those resources should be given back to our communities. Our communities hold that knowledge, not that person. And so that's a really simple example there of saying, no, we're not tolerating this any longer.
That brings up for me, Fiona, this terrible research fatigue that communities are experiencing. People are so tired and exhausted by continually being asked to provide information, give stuff away, and then not necessarily seeing any results or anything back from it. And, as a researcher, I am sometimes stuck in that space where I start a program and then I think, well, there's all these holdups for all these different reasons. And you think, well, what about these people that have gifted me their time and trust, and now this whole program has stopped. So then there's this incredible responsibility to be really transparent before you even start. These are the things I can guarantee these are the things I have no control over. You only tell me, you only work with me if you have that energy and that drive. Because as Aboriginal researchers, I think we get drawn into that whole Western way of, oh, we'll employ you because you'll be able to talk to the Murrays and da da da.
Yeah.
But it's a huge responsibility, and the fatigue I'm seeing at the moment in communities is immense.
And I build on that with a question that's come in from our live participants that really goes to the institutional constraints, particularly around research and evidence. And it's a question about the role of ethics processes. Would really just love to throw that in and invite your reflections about that in the context of everything you've been talking about that is required.
I think ethics is vital, and Indigenous ethics is different, and ways of knowing and being and doing are vital to ethical practice. And I think where I work in New South Wales, we have from a health perspective, we have the Aboriginal Health and Medical Research Council. We've got the IACSIS guide, ethical guidelines, and these guidelines have been built on the last 15, 20 years of Indigenous researchers and health workers and educationalists working together, working with community to develop and contest what is ethical, and perhaps probably the most important strategy of doing no harm to our First Nation communities. And we know, there's books and books around the harm that has been done through research and experimentation on our peoples, and the locking up of our peoples in particular scenarios. Yes, ethics is vital, and Indigenous ethics is a very good framework for people, particularly non-Indigenous researchers, to have a look, explore, examine, and there is some really good information around how we've been developing this space so that we do practice research that is safe for our people and we do no harm.
I couldn't agree more. Indigenous ethics is different. For Indigenous researchers, we get to go and ask Auntie or this elder, and we get to recalibrate and get our true north more easily, I think, than a lot of non-Indigenous researchers. So it's a matter of having those relationships that can guide you. And my big bugbear is consent. And consent is different for Indigenous peoples. And make sure you find out what that means. And consent is not about signing a piece of paper in one moment in time. Consent is about being able to change your mind when circumstances change. And I've seen some horrific things happen in terms of consent. And, in my research, I wrote about this extra step when you're gaining research, where you sit with the people you're talking to and just explore the full implications of consent with them. And I'll never forget working in a community once where I was gathering this data with the community, and someone said to me, Nicole, how are you going to write this up? Because Australia already thinks we are hopeless here. And, it made me think, I know what Australia thinks of this community, but I didn't for 1 minute think this community was plugged into that. And it was a really humbling moment where I thought, yeah, that's so damaging. And how I report back on this is so incredibly important. And the person who commissioned that research actually wanted me to change the findings. Now, a lot of people won't believe that, but this is a big national organization who said, well, can we just write it this way? But what we really want to know is, who can we blame? And community didn't want to blame. They just wanted to be healed. So, yeah, consent is another big thing, Tessa.
Thanks, Nicole. Fiona, was there anything you wanted to bring in there?
Look, it's so important. I think in my experience here, working at at the ANU, I've and being head of this research, and I've written heaps of letters to the editor on journals saying, you know, you're using terrible language here, you're causing further harm the way you're writing about this. And so all of those people have been given ethics approval, right? And so I think there's unfortunately a role for educating ethics committees, and we've got to keep bringing them along, because it is different. And look, I know I sound like a bit of a broken record, but it's better. It's more quality. We're held to a different standard. I get asked about how I manage finances, and you know, I started as a cadet in ATSIC when we were audited every quarter, and never had a bad audit done. Like, we have to stand in our communities and say what we've spent money on. So and that is a way better, more robust report than any other report a system here can throw at me. So, you know, we for all the bad things that get said about us, that's who we are. That's who we actually are. The way we're portrayed in media and elsewhere, the way we're told we're not non-compliant or we're not easy to collaborate with, it's because we're actually held to a higher standard. And that's a really important observation to help me support my team, serve my team, because we continue to grow and continue to be in demand to produce all this safe research for and on behalf of community.
What a really important way to round out this conversation about ways of knowing and ways of working. And I want to thank you all as we get to the end of time. Professor Sherwood, did you want a final word?
I just want to share a quote from around ethics. And it's what I've learned or felt people have tried to explain to me over time is that for the issues that occur on their land, for all these things that affect people, that they have their own authority to speak, and that to articulate that to someone else and in the academic manner to frame it within someone else's theoretical framework or whatever worldview was not to present the evidence as it stood, so to speak. The evidence was that people's voice has its own authority, and it has its own source of authority even more so. To deny that was to deny the person and to challenge their well-being, which is what's happening in research.
Thank you. I'm going to need to draw this conversation to a close, much as I would love to keep it going. And I really just want to thank the three of you, Professor Juanita Sherwood, Fiona Cornforth, and Dr. Nicole Tujague, for the incredible depth of knowledge that you hold and have shared with us, and for that really key takeaway that respect and recognition of these methodologies includes an understanding that they are held and practiced by First Nations researchers, and that the work of non-Indigenous peoples and non-Indigenous-led organisations like ANROWS is to understand, respect, value and resource that practice, not to appropriate it or colonise it. So to round us out, I want to invite participants to come back to Australia's National Research Agenda, which is the hook that we've used for this incredible conversation, because it calls out the need for different ways of knowing and working and provides an anchor for everyone in this work to continue moving forward. Finally, please keep an eye on the ANROWS website and newsletter for information about the next webinar in this series on Australia's National Research Agenda. My thanks to everyone who's joined us in this conversation, and most particularly to our incredible panellists. Thank you.
Thanks for having us, Tessa.